Hello, welcome back to True Crime Lounge. This is part 3 of 4 of our series on the death of George Reeves. And today we're going to be talking about Jack Lawson, um, Marky Bonanza, Toni Mannix, and Lenore Lemmon. If you're new here, hit that like button, ring that bell for notifications. Also, please subscribe. In next episode, you will get to figure out who we're talking about next on our old Hollywood cases. Now, let me jump right into it because this is going to be a bit of a long one. I know, compared to these last few, so long. They were so short. But anyway, your time is valuable and so is my time. Um, so, basically, Jack Larson would play a reporter by the name of Jimmy Olsen. Um, Gene Hackman would play Lex Luthor. Um, and I'm going to be frank with y'all, I could care less about superheroes if I am being honest. I really can't. So why do we have to have so many superhero shows? Why? Can someone tell me, please? But anyway, um, the TV show would appear in or premieres on September 19, 1952. No one had any idea it would be played out, and at least all the characters. And the Adventures of Superman have been popular on the radio, and it starred Bud Collyer. Now, um, for close to a decade in 1940s, when the TV show premiered. However, many radio shows were unable to successfully make the transition from pure sound medium to sound and visual ones, and it was a risky venture. Trading the sound effects for visual effects. Now, there were a number of Superman movies in the late 40s starring Kirk Allen in their title role, but reducing the small action to a small screen was a risky venture. So, with the drawbacks, the TV, the TV incarnation of Superman exceeded expectations in its first season, and it was already beginning to draw a cult following and retain the following throughout the episodes. In addition, um, to the Reeves character who played it included Jack Larson as Jimmy Olsen, Phyllis Coates, and later Noel Neal as Lois Lane, John Hamilton as um as Perry White, and Robert Shane as Inspector Henderson. The first two seasons were produced in black and white, while the other seasons were produced in color. However, you really could not tell because at the time TVs were still showing black and white. So this became a marketing bonanza. There was there was comic books. There were comic books. And everything. And his personal life was not the most exemplary, but people looked up to him. That's the thing. Even like show brought families together for crying out loud. Now, Reeves also performed a number of benefits and charitables in LA, and everything. And he also did many benefits and appearances for and with children, as early as Superman. At the time of those disappearances with children, he tried to impress upon them the importance of obeying the law and doing the right thing. He was always courtly, polite, smiling, and everything. So one story bully. Now he also had a child attempt to shoot him to see if the bullets would bounce off, as one story goes. But yeah, But even his like his personal appearance was not as lucrative as the character's creators. Like they had action figures, comic books, lunchboxes, and everything made for this. Now, according to several accounts, like he was even more lucrative with his paychecks. In the beginning, um his personal appearances were lucrative. Like he was getting about $200 per episode, risking his life performing most of his own stunts, and being held up by writers is stimulating. Now he would go on to meet a Miss Toni Mannix. And this was a bit. And she was married, but they had a very like it was a public, but it wasn't a public affair. Does that make sense? Basically, Mannix was married to a much older Hollywood man, and he had Eddie Mannix, and he had a Japanese mistress, so it was known. But apparently, the press knew this, but they never published this at all. So, but Reeves would approach him and seduce him with sex and everything else, and it was apparently his most fulfilling relationship. So, if that tells you anything, also tells me this guy has some deep problems. So, Reeves was 8 years older, and nonetheless, she was still attracted to him, and everything. And so Diane Lane would go on to play Tony in a movie, and in one memorable scene, apparently the four of them were at a restaurant, and Reeves was trying to be polite, but Mannix was like, "Don't talk to her; she doesn't speak English." So, but their relationship ended when um Tony was in her early 50s. And her fear that she might actually lose one of her most eligible bachelors in Hollywood was well rounded grounded. And it finally happened just as the fictitious Superman was surrounded by people who had the initials LL. The real life George Reeves found one of his own, and her name, Lenore Lemmon. It sounds like a stripper name if I'm being honest. I know. But Lenore was a young, bold brunette who was spy on him and dining in restaurants, and she immediately sets her cap on him. Sipping away her female companion at a bar, she makes her way over to the table, makes a move on him. That night, she straddles him in bed and using her best weapon of feminine arsenal to tighten her noose around him. Now, that's how it happened in the book, but according to all accounts, it wasn't very much in real life. The relationship didn't take too much effort and progress from there. Reeves in New York, single and fancy free, Tony was legally married 3,000 miles away in California. Now, Reeves and Tony simply hung on to what they had for another 4 years, and Mannix would have been dead if they could have been free to marry. So, but apparently Reeves had other ideas. But one woman who had been divorced for 8 years was ready to make a shot at it. And little is known about Lenore Lemmon. And she was known in her early years as a so-called cafe society member of the so-called cafe society, and that was the collective description of affably beautiful people who gathered in fashionable cafes and restaurants in Paris, London, Rome, New York, beginning in the late 1800s. Although members of the Cafe Society were not necessarily members of society's elite, they attended each other's private events, dinners, and balls, and took holidays in exotic locations and elegant resorts. In the U.S., the term cafe society described those as they're entertaining semi publicly and in restaurants and nightclubs who were also included among the groups of movie stars. Now, they were gradually publicly housed who wanted to be seen and photographed and written in society as she calls them. In the late 1950s, they were readily availability to the air travel and jet skis. More importantly, because of this descriptive. Um, Now in 1941, Lenore would marry Jacob L. Jakey Webb, who was reportedly a descendant of railroad magnate and multimillionaire Cornelius Vanderbilt, and their marriage was short-lived. However, she quickly discovered that he was almost completely um, tattooed, she left him, later and sued for a divorce in the grounds of desertion. Now, once she and Reeves became deeply involved, Lenore proved to be as possessive and jealous as Toni. In the movie, is shown to be she is shown to be I'm not gonna say that word, but witchy, arrogant, domineering, and nonetheless, he loved her, and he broke off the relationship with Toni, resulting in a nasty confrontation that provided one of the most memorable scenes in the movie. And one of the expletives were held back. Lenore soon moved into the Benedict Canyon house that Tony bought him, and Reeves and Lenore were scheduled to be married in Mexico, June 19th, 1959, when they would spend their honeymoon in Europe, and their trip in the wedding never took place. In the early mornings of June 16th, 1959, one shot, probably more, rang the bedroom of George Reeves. The 45-year-old star on the TV series The World's with Superman, who was idolized by millions, was found dead. That is it for part 3 of 4. Join me as we for our next episode as we're going to be finishing up our series. But yes, but y'all have a great day.